Good evening, everyone, and good afternoon, Ethan. We are opening this session, which is, as many of you know, we have started this new series, which we call in French Nocturne, of Thursday Nocturne, which is a series organized for the whole School of Management and Innovation. Students coming from all possible masters that we have: finance, strategy, communication, social media, human resources, and I miss some of them. But I'm glad to have you both here being hosted tonight, because for many reasons. First, because this is a topic which we are covering right now, and we want to cover even more in the future. The school has engaged in an exercise where everything that deals with data and digital will be looked at, and courses will be proposed to analyze stakes, in particular from the angle of social sciences. And I'm glad, because both of you are so legitimate to speak about it. So first of all, let me welcome our students, because I don't have the opportunity to see them at all. So it's not that I'm seeing them right now, but at least I know they see us, and I want to make sure that they're doing fine. It's the second half of the term, so I hope the first half went okay. I want to tell them as well that if they feel they need to speak or share, views or have issues in those very, specific and hard times, they should feel, free to reach out, knock at the door, the virtual door for now, and be in touch with us. It's a bit of a paradox, because we will speak probably about some of the issues with having too much, digital in our lives, and too much social media in our lives, or having it in the wrong way. And we are adding another couple of digital hours to their schedules. So I will not take too much time. What I want to say, beyond saying that we take this topic very seriously, I think we also want this discussion tonight to make our students think about their own lives, about the way social media, the scope and breadth of challenges that social media bring, in particular with civic life, and this is in the title of the presentation tonight. And this has many dimensions, and without entering into the discussion and debate, I think this has behavioral dimensions, addiction, herding. I know Bruno has this in his book. It has health dimensions, mental health, but also more general health issues, and also more at the macro level, political consequences, economic consequences. That's, for example, a course I would like to introduce next year, the economics of platforms and the economics of social media. And it also has implications for freedom at the very deep sense of the word. So the last minutes of my time I will use to introduce our speaker. So speaker number one, which is the mediator between us and speaker number two, is Bruno Patino, who was kind enough to, after leaving Sciences Po, where he has been the dean of the School of Journalism for many years, he left for very high spheres, because he's now the president of Arte. He accepted to stay with us at the school as a special advisor, scientific advisor, for shaping this data digital curriculum, but also for shaping the strategy of the school. So we are very grateful for that. As I said, he's the president of Arte France. He's the author of a very interesting book, which I'm sure he discussed in his course with his students. But for those of you who are listening to us tonight and did not attend the course, this is a must read, La civilisation du poisson rouge. I should have checked, Bruno. I don't know if it's been translated, but you'll probably say that later. And we have our host, the host of our host, which is our host, Ethan Zuckerman, who is associate professor at the College of Information and Computer Sciences at UMass at Amherst. His topics, he also has, previous books, but a book which is now out, I think I understand, was published very recently, Mistrust, he has it on his background. If you see the orange letters, that's the one. And he will discuss it in more details in a few moments. So I'm leaving it there, and I'm really looking forward to listening to you. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Natacha, and I will be very, very brief. Just to say a very warm thank you to Ethan. I've been knowing Ethan for a couple of years now. In studied, he carried out with Dominique Cardon at the Media Lab, and for a lot of his works that we really cherish at Sciences Po and which inspires us. So it's a great chance to have him here. I think when I look at Wikipedia, let's say he's a professor and an activist, and I think it's a great definition, in fact, because Ethan thinks, research, and acts, and I think he will talk to us about it, and I will just leave the floor to him, and after that I'll try to organize the Q&A session. Ethan, please.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you, Natacha, and it's really wonderful to be here. Let me just say for the students, thank you so much. I know how hard this is. I'm teaching virtually this semester to my students at UMass, and I know that we're all suffering Zoom fatigue. So I really appreciate people being willing to spend a bit more time. I want to talk a little bit about the book that Natacha was kind enough to reference, but then Bruno has really asked me to talk about some of the new work that I'm doing. Just to check, can you see my slides? Are you getting me superimposed over? Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. So thank you. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but of course we're all suffering that at the moment. But I wanted to share with you some thoughts that I've been having, as Bruno said, really at the intersection between study and activism. And that's what my work has historically been about. I just published a book in the US called Mistrust. And I'll give you the very compact version of the argument of the book, because to be perfectly honest, writing this book convinced me to work on what I'm working on now, which is trying to reform the state of social media and build very different sorts of social media platforms. So this book, which is out in the US and the UK, I'm hoping we will find a French publisher for it as well. It's about a fairly simple but very powerful phenomenon. And the phenomenon is this: in the US, and frankly, in many advanced democracies, and I would argue that France is absolutely in the same situation as the US, trust in different forms of institutions is collapsing. This is a graph of Americans' trust in their government in Washington. If you look back to the 1960s, you have more than 3 out of 4 Americans saying they trust the government. Since 2010, you've had fewer than 1 in 5 Americans who trust the government. This feels like a very new phenomenon. It's actually much older. A lot of it happens during the 1970s and 80s. This is a moment where, at least in the US and the UK, the public and government sort of break their old relationship and come up with a new one. Under Reagan in the US, under Thatcher in the UK, the government decides to do less, decides to provide less, and in turn, you see citizens trusting the government less. What's interesting is that it isn't just citizens' relationship with government. What I found in my research is that citizens in the US, at least, have declined in trust in all sorts of institutions. So not only do Americans no longer trust the government, they no longer trust business, they no longer trust banks, they don't trust newspapers, they don't trust all sorts of different institutions, including the university. And when we try to figure out why this happens, it has to do with 2 sets of forces. One are these very broad social trends. It turns out that as people get better educated, as they become more critical, as they have more access to information, they become less trusting. They have a better ability to sort of pick apart at systems and see why they fail. But the bigger changes have to do with big social trends like rising inequality. So what we can see in part through Thomas Piketty's research is that as inequality is on the rise in the US and the UK and other societies, trust in institutions goes down. And the way that I think of this is that when systems are no longer meeting people's needs, when people feel like the system they are working within is no longer working to their benefit, they feel like those systems are a failure and they don't trust them anymore. There's also a problem that when individual systems fail, people lose trust in them. So Americans had a good deal of trust in big business and in banks until 2007, 2008. And then we have the financial crisis and trust collapses. Americans had a lot of faith in churches, but then we had the Catholic Church sex scandal, trust collapses. And right now we're going through another wave of collapse in trust over coronavirus and how that's being handled. And so the book is meant not to be a bad news book. It's actually meant to be a book recognizing people who are figuring out how to make social change, even in the face of this collapse in trust. And the problem is this: if you don't believe the government is an effective way to make change, if you don't feel like the government can actually change the big problems of society, most of how we know to participate in civics doesn't work anymore. It doesn't make sense to vote anymore. It may not even make sense to protest anymore if the government can't make the change that we are asking for. But we're seeing people who are thinking about different ways to make change. They're trying to change hearts and minds, and they're also trying to build new institutions to replace the institutions that they think are broken. So one of the big movements in the United States right now is called defund the police. And it's this theory that policing in the US is so racially biased, it's so dangerous to people of color, that you may not be able to fix the institution. What you might actually have to do is eliminate it and build a new institution in its place. And so what this book that I just published tries to do is take seriously this idea that maybe there are institutions that don't just need a little change, they need radical, fundamental change. They really need to be shaken to their core and built back better or radically different. So I try to take my own writing seriously. I wrote this book, and at the end of it, I said, well, what is it that I want to do? How do I think I should work on making change? And I ended up concluding that the place where I felt like I wanted to make change was around social media. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that I've been involved with social media for a very long time. I was one of the founders of a firm in the late 1990s, which was one of the first web companies that would allow you to put up your own web page. That is the invention of what people now call user-generated content. And that's the idea that's behind Facebook, it's behind Instagram, it's behind YouTube or TikTok. It's that idea that the web is going to be made by amateurs, by you, not by professionals. I'm also the inventor of maybe one of the most despised technologies in history, which is the pop-up ad, which ended up being created as a way of trying to make money off of user-generated content because the advertisers didn't want to be too closely associated with it. So I have been apologizing and sort of trying to make up for my sins around the pop-up ad for many, many years now. So I'm personally involved with what's gone wrong with social media, but I'm also very interested in how this has become a big social trend. So this is an illustration here from an article by a friend of mine, Siva Vaidyanathan, called Making Sense of the Facebook Menace. And you can see just by the language and by the illustration, this is really how many people are starting to look at social media platforms. They see them as inherently evil, almost demonic, which is interesting because only 10 years ago, these were the most exciting new companies. They were changing how we related to one another and related to the world. And now we're looking at them and seeing a whole world of sins associated with them. So it's worth asking this question: when people are so critical of social media, what is it that they are actually worried about? And here are some of the things that I have seen people express. There's a theory that social media may actually be personally bad for us. I think my friend Bruno might fit in this camp. I think the notion of our attention span shrinking, as we see in Société de la Poisson Rouge, I think this notion that you're seeing from someone like Sherry Turkle, who's a scholar at MIT, she believes that social media leaves us with a very inauthentic sense of connection. We are connected to others, but we are deeply lonely because it's not a real connection. The gentleman above my head is Tristan Harris. He's a guy who worked for Google, but then sort of left social media, saying that he thought that social media companies were using technologies of addiction. They were trying to get us to use their technology in the same way that we might use a slot machine. We play it over and over uncontrollably. So there's a whole thesis that social media for us is personally bad. It's personally dangerous. It's harming us as individuals. A second theory, and this I think is a place where the fact that Natacha is in this conversation as an economist, we're very, very worried that social media is destroying, at least in the US, the economic basis for journalism. And you can see in the graph that that black line is money going to US newspapers. The blue line is Google's ad revenues going up. You can watch them sort of cross over. The reason that's so important is that high quality reporting in the US comes almost exclusively from newspapers. Our public media sector is very, very weak. Our broadcast media is really more about entertainment than it is about news gathering. The real work of producing news tends to be in the newspapers. And as advertising is moving out of the newspaper and moving online, there is this fear that social media is killing journalism. Now, it's complicated, right? That's probably not the whole picture, but that's going to turn out to be true of sort of all of these factors. Here's a third one that people are very worried about. People are worried that social media is making us more politically polarized, that the left and the right have an even harder time talking to one another. One of the theories behind this is that social media may itself be making it hard for us to see opinions from the other side. My dear friend Eli Pariser wrote a very popular book called The Filter Bubble. It made this argument that even if you are looking for people who have politically different opinions from you, that social media can make it very hard to see those opinions. Now, this has actually been experimentally tested. It turns out that it's not actually the fault of the algorithms. It's actually mostly our fault. We tend to choose to spend time with people who share our political points of view. Most of us don't like to be in a confrontation with people who have different points of view. But this idea that Facebook, that WhatsApp, that YouTube is polarizing us, that we are caught in echo chambers, that's incredibly popular. Fourth theory, this is something that's become very, very important in the US, is this very strong sense that the far right, the Nazis, the ethno-nationalists, the white supremacists are using social media to recruit. And let me say, this is undoubtedly true. There is a whole wave of content that is designed to convince people of white superiority, white nationalism. What's perhaps not true is that you are likely to stumble on this by accident. There's a recent study that just came out that suggests that most of the people who find this content are looking for it. But there is no doubt that that content is out there and that it is making it easier for people to take more extreme political points of view. And then finally, this may be the most disturbing one, there is a real sense in the United States right now that we no longer agree on reality. I started writing about this about 2 years ago, and when I wrote this, I think it was considered quite far out. I started talking in 2019 about QAnon and was urging fellow scholars to take it seriously because I saw what QAnon was doing as sort of attacking this idea that we all live with the same set of facts, that we all live in a common reality. And I have to say, it's very hard to understand what happened in the United States earlier this year without thinking about this idea of reality sort of breaking in half. We have one political party in our country that embraced a lie. There's really no other way to talk about it. We had a free and fair election. Donald Trump lost, but he then embraced this theory that everything from all the different states and their election systems and all the courts and all the media were somehow lying to us and that he'd won the election. But some large number of Americans, including the people who actually stormed the US Capitol, believed that reality more than they believed the reality that I live in, where Trump lost the election. And one of the real fears right now in the United States is that we may no longer have a single shared reality, which makes it very, very hard to do politics, to do civics. So is social media responsible for all of these bad things? Is it bad for us as individuals? Is it bad for us as a society? I want to give you a very decisive scholarly answer, which is, I don't know. And the reason I don't know is not that I am ignorant of this. It's that it's really hard to know. It's really, really hard to study these questions. First of all, most of what we know about these questions falls into sort of two different camps. There's an enormous amount of media that is really centered on this idea that social media and technology as a whole is very bad for us. And this is a social phenomenon called techno-panic. We've seen this at a number of different points in history. We see moments where a new technology comes on the scene and everybody panics that somehow it's going to make us dumb, it's going to make us violent. We've seen this not just around the internet, we've seen it around television, we've seen it around radio. If you go back through time, you can find techno-panic about the book, where Greek scholars worry that people will lose their memory. They will lose their ability to recite poetry now that we have the technology of the book in hand. Techno-panics are not completely made up. They're a very real reaction to the ways that technology changed society, but they are often overblown. They are often sort of an exaggeration of the threat. A second problem we have is that many of these sort of documents that are worried about the new technologies are not working from big data sets. They're working from anecdote, or what we tend to call anecdata, right? The hope is that if we have enough small anecdotes, they look like data. Eli Pariser's book starts with an experiment that he does with 2 or 3 friends. And based on that experiment of 3 people, he concludes that Google is serving very different information to different people. When scholars have repeated that experiment with thousands and thousands of people, the effects are actually very, very small. But it's not really Eli's fault. It's actually very, very hard to get this data. I just published a paper with some colleagues that looks at different ways to try to squeeze data out of Twitter, out of Facebook, out of YouTube. Much of what we advocate for is against the law. And we advocate for it because it is so important to get this data that we actually think the correct thing to do is to violate terms of service of these websites and to potentially take some very serious legal risk so that we can actually study at scale. What do we find when we study at large scale? One of the things that we find is that these effects are real, but they tend to be smaller than we think. So this is a very, very good study. We tend to refer to this as the Orban study, which looks at 3 large studies of adolescent well-being, basically surveys of teenagers saying, are you happy? Are you healthy? Are you developing well? And then looking to find unhappy teenagers, and then looking to find factors in their life that might be associated with unhappiness. And it turns out in this study that heavy social media use is associated with being less happy as a teenager. But it is a much smaller effect than other things. If you wear glasses as a teenager, you have a much higher chance of being unhappy. If you are short, or like me, fat, you have a much higher chance of being unhappy as a teenager. In fact, the effects of heavy social media use are statistically equivalent to the effects of eating a diet heavy in potatoes. So if you enjoy pommes frites as a teen, you are less likely to be happy, and it's about as big an effect as heavy social media use. So it's probably not the thing we should really be focusing on. It's a small phenomenon compared to some of the other things that we can change, like drug use, like bad parenting, which have much, much heavier effects on teenage happiness. But of course, it's not fun to talk about potatoes and banning potatoes, right? We get fascinated with new technology and sort of what we should do about new technology. Now, all of this that I have just said, everything that I've just said, sort of questioning the harms of social media, I actually think it's worth asking this question. Is social media bad for individuals? Is it bad for society? We really don't know. We don't have rigorous enough data yet. We don't have enough clarity on it. But if social media turns out to be bad for us, we should not be surprised. And the reason we should not be surprised was that social media was never designed to be good for us. There is a model, an economic model, that underlies social media that we are now beginning to recognize and understand. Shoshana Zuboff refers to this model as surveillance capitalism. The idea is that if you are getting a service for free online, you are actually the product being sold. The point of Facebook is not to provide you with a service, it is to deliver you as a service to advertisers. And so Facebook is an extractive industry. It strip mines you and takes as much data from you as possible to package you and deliver you to advertisers. And Zuboff makes the argument that there are all sorts of consequences of this model. One of those consequences is that social media tends towards extremes. It tends towards drama. It tends towards high emotion. because those are the sorts of things that keep people watching, that keep people focused, and that capture their attention. So there's a huge amount of discussion right now, at least in the US, but I know in other parts of Europe as well. Actually, I'm having many conversations with friends in the Netherlands who are very much working on this, that existing social media may be failing to provide us with the spaces that help us be good and healthy citizens, that help us have productive social and political discussions. And I want to argue that most of the time, when we talk about this problem, when we talk about what might be wrong with social media, we talk in terms of how do we fix Facebook? And I think that's a terrible idea, because I actually think we need to be thinking much more broadly. Right now, Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, they are a market failure. These are companies that are producing something that is entertaining for us, but they are failing to produce these spaces that are civically healthy for us. And we are compounding that market failure with our own failure of imagination. We are not willing to imagine that social media could function differently. So I want to go back in history to sort of make this case. And if you find this compelling, I've written a couple of articles about it. You're welcome to come and read it. But I want to go back more than 100 years, and I want to go back to the invention of radio. Radio, up until 1912, meant Morse code, dots and dashes, static, transmitted. And it was even important then. It was enormously important during the First World War. But up until 1912, it was not possible to broadcast music or the voice or anything like that wirelessly. In 1912, we have the invention of the vacuum tube amplifier. And suddenly, for the first time, all of that wireless radio gear used during World War I can be used to transmit voice, can be used to transmit music. And what happens is this incredible, super rapid explosion of radio as a medium. We tend to think of the internet developing very quickly. Actually, it's 29 years before we have the technology that makes the internet possible to the moment where we actually have a commercial internet with Google and with widespread advertising and things like that. It's only 10 years between the invention of audio over the radio and commercial radio that looks, frankly, the way it does today. That's a photograph from 1922 from a radio station that is still a dominant player in the US, WOR out of New York City. That's still an enormous and very profitable radio station. And quite frankly, its business model has not changed very much in the last 98 years. What's remarkable about radio is not just how fast it develops, but the incredible diversity with which it develops. Now, let me start by sort of apologizing here. I have not been able to find enough about early French radio. I'm hoping Bruno will actually point me towards the early histories of French radio, and particularly public broadcasting. But I want to talk about how radio evolves in the US, in the Soviet Union, and in the UK. Because what happens is in those 10 years between 1912 and 1922, radio is completely different in these three different countries. In the US, everyone starts a radio station. And I mean everyone. Schools start radio stations, churches start radio stations. Some of the very popular early radio stations are hosted by department stores because they want people to come in and buy records and radio sets, so they use it to advertise those things. The most popular radio stations early on are run by hotels because they have orchestras that play every night in their ballroom, and they realize that they can advertise the orchestra by playing it over the radio, and maybe the next night someone will come and dance in the ballroom. But by 1922, a model emerges, and the model is very simple. People can pay the phone company to have a telephone line to the radio station, and they can read an advertisement and have it go out over the broadcast, and that is worth enough money that it subsidizes the rest of the business. And so a business in which content is supported by broadcast advertising, by 1922, that's firmly established. All these non-commercial broadcasters, they start dying off, and we have sort of radio the way that we know it. Radio comes to the Soviet Union right after the Bolshevik Revolution, right after the advent of the Soviet Union, and it's born in an entirely different way. Radio in the Soviet Union is broadcast over loudspeakers. People don't own their own radios. It's broadcast in factories, it's broadcast in town squares, and it's an incredibly powerful tool for helping illiterate peasants learn why communism is so great and why they are so happy that the Soviet Union is now a communist state. It's not even until the late 1930s or 40s that you end up with private radio units. And when you have units like this, you'll notice that they have only one knob. And that's because there's only one station. Your choice is whether it is on or off, or how loud or how soft it is. You don't need a tuning knob, comrade. There is really only one thing to listen to. So you have an open commercial model in the US. You have a fully state-controlled model in the USSR. In Britain, you have something entirely different. It is a single radio station. Britain very consciously chooses not to go down the crazy US route of having lots of different options. But it also decides that this is not going to be government media. This is going to be independent media. It's going to be governed by its own corporation. That corporation is going to be sponsored by a license fee on radio sets, so it has its own revenue stream. And very early in the advent of the BBC, it demonstrates its independence. There is a strike, a labor strike that happens in Britain. Newspapers shut down because the people working for the newspapers are not working. The BBC is the only source of information, and they shock the nation because not only do they allow the prime minister to speak to the nation, they allow the labor leaders to speak to the nation. And in the process, they establish this idea that you can have media that is critical of the government, that has independence from the government, but has an explicit public purpose. Now, my point is not to argue for any one of these three ways of doing things over the other. It's to point out that business models are not inevitable when we adopt new technologies. Different societies adopt entirely different models for how a technology rolls out. What's happened with the internet is that we have largely ended up buying the US model. The US model where everything is commercially supported, everything is free. We don't talk very much about the public interest. There's very few places like Wikipedia where we sort of say we're going to donate money, we're going to support this because it's good for all of us. Normally what we do is we rely on that surveillance capitalism model. But there's other good news from history, which is that it's possible to change your path even when a technology is fairly mature. So the US in the early 1960s has become a nation of television watchers. Television is now the dominant medium. It works on the same logic as radio. It's supported by advertising. And the truth is, it's mostly light entertainment. And a lot of it is very bad. In the late 1950s, the most popular shows are quiz shows, they're game shows. There's a scandal where it's discovered that most of them are rigged. They're not actually giving the prizes out, they're giving the answers to people. So there's a lot of need for oversight. And this new commissioner of broadcasting named Newt Minow comes in, and he gives an address to the National Association of Broadcasters. And he says, look, television at its best could be humanity's greatest achievement. But if you look at what we are accomplishing right now on television, and you watch a whole day of television programming, what you will see is a vast wasteland. And this is actually known as the vast wasteland speech. It's terrifying to broadcasters. Broadcasters are so afraid that minnow is going to shut down television. They start making some very dark jokes. One of the popular shows at the time is a show called Gilligan's Island, where a bunch of wacky characters end up marooned on a tropical island. The name of the boat that runs aground is the SS Minnow. And that is actually a reference to this bureaucrat who is threatening to change how television works. They are worried that Minnow is actually going to shut off their ability to make sort of humorous shows like this. What Minnow does instead is he starts creating a public broadcasting system in America 50 years after the Brits do it, right? Very, very far into a mature ecosystem. And what he says is, look, I don't want to stop the entertainment. I don't want to shut off all that stuff that people really enjoy. What I want to do is fill in the places where the market has failed. And the market is mostly failing us around news, civic programming, and children, right? We're doing a terrible job of creating good children's programming. We need to invest in that. We don't have good civic fora on television. We need to invest in that. And so rather than trying to throw out one model, he comes up with this idea that we can complement what we have. So that's really what I'm trying to do. How do we get from the sort of trashy television of Gilligan's Island to the very socially beneficial television of, in this case, Sesame Street, which is sort of beloved in the United States as a way of using television as a way of educating young children? How can we raise our aspirations for what a medium can be? So I'm really interested in this question. Could we build social media that, instead of being bad for us in the way that Bruno fears and so many other critics fear, could we build social media that is plural in purpose, right? It's not just one size fits all. It's not just that there is one Facebook to serve almost 3 billion people. Instead, there are thousands of different communities that have different rules, that have different norms and affordances. Can we build social media that has an explicit public spirit to it, a goal of trying to make us better citizens and better neighbors to one another? Can we build social media that allows us to govern it? Right now, social media is governed by the platforms. What would happen if we govern it ourselves? And there's examples for how this could work. One of my heroes is a young woman from Bahrain. Her name is Ezra Al-Shafei. She runs a consultancy called Majal. And what Majal tries to do is to create public spaces in the Arab world that don't otherwise exist online. And one of the most remarkable of these is a site called Awa. It is an open space for lesbian, gay, transgender, queer issues in the Middle East. Now, she's in Bahrain, and a lot of her audience is in Saudi Arabia. These are places where outing yourself as gay or lesbian is incredibly dangerous. And so the tools that she's building look very unfamiliar to us. For one thing, you can't post any photos. You can't have an avatar of yourself as a photo. In fact, that's Ezra's avatar on this platform, because it's simply too dangerous to have anyone identifiable by photo. It makes it easy for the authorities to arrest them. And this is not a theoretical threat. This happens all the time within Saudi, within Bahrain. You have to be approved into the community. You have to participate in a discussion before you can start your own discussion. It has very, very strict rules, which we would not want to use for every conversation. But for the conversation of LGBTQ issues in Bahrain, it actually makes a great deal of sense. And it's sort of an example of why you might want the flexibility of having your own rules for a community. Another inspiration to me in all of this is Wael Ghonim. So Wael is a name you might know if you followed the Arab Spring in Egypt very closely. There was a very important social media site. It was a Facebook group. It was called We Are All Khaled Said. And that site used the death of a young man at the hand of the police to rally people out into Tahrir Square, where they ultimately overthrew Mubarak. And Ghonim was the administrator of that page. And so Ghonim found himself at the center of the Arab Spring. In fact, at one point, Mubarak called Ghonim up and said, look, I'll negotiate with you. Please take your people out of Tahrir Square. And Ghonim had to say, you don't get it. I'm not a political leader. These are just people who hate you and want you gone. It's not that we're looking for a power sharing agreement. It's that I made it possible for people to share their emotions. Ghonim was really disappointed with what happened after the Mubarak government left. And he felt that it was that Facebook was a great tool for rallying against something, but it was a terrible space in which to actually have high quality discussions about how the future of Egypt should unfold. So he decided to start a new network called Parlio. It was designed not to be for everyone. It was designed to be for young political leaders. It had a very strong code of civility. If you were uncivil, if you even refused to participate in conversations that were opened up in good faith, you could be thrown off. And it did quite well for about 2 years. It got absorbed by the Quora website, but it was a very great example of what you could do turning an online space into a deliberative space. We're seeing a lot of experiments on the Reddit website. A lot of people think of Reddit as sort of the Wild West, the dangerous area of the internet. And there are certainly parts of it that are unmanaged and ungoverned. But there's also a lot of aspects of Reddit that are very successful. And they're successful because the community takes responsibility for its conduct. Reddit is governed by moderators. They're volunteers. They come out of a community and they take on the work of controlling the content there. My former student, who now teaches at Cornell, has actually been studying the ways in which successful communities manage and govern themselves, and doing very large scale experiments in sort of trying to figure out what lets people govern these spaces effectively. Self-governance, I believe, is utterly critical for a future of social media. It's so damaging that we have given up this responsibility and outsourced it to Facebook or to YouTube, because it frees us from the responsibility of actually having a conversation about what behavior is acceptable and unacceptable. And we are losing many of the ways in which we sort of learn how to be participants in a democracy, how to have these difficult conversations about governance, because we're not involved with these things. So when you start putting these things together, fairly extraordinary things can start happening. And what's interesting is they start happening at the fringes. One of the communities that I am studying right now is called Twitter. It is sex worker Twitter. So this is an alternative to Twitter for people who make their living as prostitutes, as escorts, as producing their own pornography. And the reason they have ended up building their own tools is that the US passed a pair of laws in 2018 that basically criminalized any sort of sexual transaction online. It became incredibly dangerous to host ads for sex work because there was fear that you would be prosecuted for contributing to sex trafficking. And so what happened was a group of sex workers in Australia decided to build their own alternative platform. They built it on top of open source code, Mastodon. They've started creating some of these services that used to be hosted in the US, but not only are they replacing these services, but they're building them for and with the communities who need them. and with representation of those communities in the process of building these things. So I am trying to research and start building a vision of social media where there are many, many different communities involved. You might be a member not just of Facebook and Twitter, but you might be a member of the community around your village or your local coffee shop or the sports team that you support, or a support group for people who suffer from the same health problems that you suffer from. You might be a member of 30 or 40 of these different communities. But rather than having separate icons on your phone for all of them, they aggregate together. You have the way of looking at these networks all in the same place, of controlling which ones you want to see on the same day. They're very easy to join. You can sign onto them without starting the whole sign-on process again. You simply have an account that allows you to sign onto them and join them. And the dream is that your existing social media comes in through the same set of tools. So you're using a tool that lets you look at Instagram, it lets you look at Snapchat, but it also lets you look at these new kind of social networks, which are much smaller and which you are responsible in part for governing. You can actually see some early visions of what this tool might look like. We started developing it over at MIT. I'm now bringing it over to the University of Massachusetts. Gobo is a tool that lets you look at Twitter and Facebook and Mastodon at the same time. We're going to be expanding it to bring many, many new social networks on top of it. And we're also going out and trying experiments with small communities about building their own social networks to sort of include within this. How do we finance all of this? I actually think that we shouldn't be paying for much of this. I actually think the way to get towards this is to try taxing, and specifically to tax surveillance advertising, to tax this form of advertising that tracks us all over the web, that makes assumptions about who we are based on our behavior. This is not my idea. It actually comes from the Nobel Prize winning economist Paul Romer, who believes that if we tax this business model, we will see people start to shift away from it. And my vision is that we use the revenues from this tax to fund something which is sort of a government fund that helps us develop this new vision, this new generation of social media. It's actually not very hard to build a new community in this vision that I'm talking about. A community of 100 people might only cost you $100 a year to run, but building the technology actually requires millions of dollars. It requires some of the same efforts that you've seen from Facebook and from Google. Even if we had a 1% tax providing these new sorts of infrastructures, it would generate in the hundreds of millions of dollars a year. It would be more than all the money that is being spent by the major nonprofit organizations that are trying to build an open web right now. At this point in this talk, people often ask questions about whether this is in fact realistic. I want to suggest that not only is it realistic, it's actually already happening. There's a conference going on today and tomorrow, hosted by a group in the Netherlands called Public Spaces. And I just interviewed their chairman for my podcast, and it's just a remarkable project. Public Spaces is a coalition of all the major Dutch public broadcasters and all the major cultural institutions. So it's the big cultural festivals, it's the museums, it's the libraries, and it's the 8 different public broadcasters in the Netherlands. And they have gotten together and said, wait, why are we supporting Facebook? Why are we supporting YouTube? Why are we supporting all of these Silicon Valley companies that are engaged in a form of commerce that we think is wrong and immoral? Why aren't we building our own open web out of open source technologies that support our values and support our rights? And what they're doing is they're going through each of their organizations and they're doing an audit of what technologies they use, whether those technologies are consistent with their values, and then they're starting to find alternatives. And in the long run, they may end up building new structures like the sorts of social media that I'm talking about, in the short term, they're simply moving away from the most surveillant technologies to better ones. But Bruno, for you, running Arte, this is exactly sort of where that move is coming from. It's coming from the Netherlands cultural and public broadcast community asking this question of why should Europe be subsidizing the worst of the US technical models? And shouldn't we be using our public dollars in a very different way? There's also technical innovators around them, and they're very interesting people. Wiki Tribune is a new social network. It is based around a lot of the rules and laws from Wikipedia, which is not a big surprise because it's actually been started by Jimmy Wales, who is the same guy who started Wikipedia. So he decided that social media is broken enough that he is working on his own way of creating social media. It is not ad supported. It is subscriber supported. It has an explicit civic goal towards it. It's still having a tough time gaining traction, but it's a great example of sort of where people are going with these ideas. Maybe the most radical of these ideas is coming from Tim Berners-Lee, Sir Tim, who founded, the web. And he also looks at this question and says, this is terrible. I didn't mean to build something where people would be tracked and surveilled all the time. I want people to have control over their own data. He is now building an architecture called Solid, which makes it possible for you to store your data locally and still participate in something like a social network. And while this is in early phases, it's a very promising development for what the future of the net could look like. So I'm working on this vision over at UMass of building new forms of social media that can help us be better citizens and better neighbors. I'm building new tools to make it possible for you to look at these new social networks as well as existing social networks through the same tool. I'm trying to make the legal and policy changes that make it possible to do these things. And I realize that this is ambitious almost to the point of arrogance. But I actually have been responding to that lately by sort of thinking about a wonderful little story that came out in the news. You may have seen that NASA, the US Space Agency, landed another rover on Mars. And people got very interested in this parachute. And you'll notice it has a very strange design. It's asymmetrical. At first, people thought, well, you have to make it asymmetrical. It helps you figure out whether it twisted while it was open. And that's true. But the parachute actually has a message in it. It's actually coded in binary. And what it says is, dare mighty things. I think it's actually important that we don't limit our ambitions. I think in many cases, the most dangerous thing we can do is accept reality as it is and only try to make very small changes. I think we're reaching a point in our civic life, in our political life, and particularly in our technological life, where the changes that we need are quite mighty, and where we actually have to be willing to sort of take the risk and fail on a very, very big scale if we want to change things. So those are some of the ideas that I'm working on right now. I'm hoping we can have a conversation about it. I'm so grateful for you giving me this attention. I know that it's hard to learn and to sort of interact in this fashion, but I hope maybe we can use this as a provocation and a start of a conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ethan. Let's please take some questions. And
yeah,
the messages are coming with the thank you, but
I'm seeing the thank yous, but we should get some questions.
We should get some questions if you want.
Bruno, I'm challenging you very directly in this talk. Do you wanna start with some responses or some feedback?
Well, it seems to me that first of all, thank you very much for your presentation, and I think it's always very interesting to see the point you're making. That is, we are not really able to study the real impact. I mean, the real size of the impact that social media have on the personal life and on the social life. But in a way, we feel there is something going on there, and maybe the feeling is something as real as the real impact. I mean, something we should concentrate on. But otherwise, the fact that you are always reminding us that those companies are in fact advertising-oriented companies, and so profit-oriented companies, we should not be surprised that they do not have the global well-being as a tool. When you're challenging me, saying that you're running an European public media, what do you do? I take the point. It is in fact a real discussion we have with the European authorities, in fact, and so it is a question that it's an enduring one, because for the time being we are torn in a dilemma that would be either you will not reach a whole category of the population if you do not go through Facebook and YouTube, not to mention them. And frankly speaking, for a very large range of the European population now, the video content, rather coming from the TV or from the users, it is YouTube.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in fact, if you want to speak about Arte, we are reaching millions of people through YouTube that we wouldn't be able to reach without YouTube, because we don't have the tool. When you're speaking about public broadcasting media, it's because the state in Great Britain and in France after the Second World War gave the waves, in fact. The media owned the waves and gave the frequencies to those media in exchange for a certain range of things. And so today the problem is the problem of access. How do you access those people? So in fact, it's a good it's a very good challenge. My feeling is that we do have to align the planets, as we say in France, between the European Commission, in fact, the national states, and the public media sector, in order to try to build a solution. But it's kind of difficult, because if at the time being you decide to have your own tool, it lamentably fails. I will just waiting for questions. I hope questions are coming. Please ask questions.
They are, Bruno. We're getting some good ones.
Good.
I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it tonight, because I know that this is your 9th Zoom of the day. I'm going to introduce you to Gert-Jan Bochert, who is the head of digital at VRBO, which is one of the big Dutch public broadcasters. He actually leads this public spaces initiative. And I just did an hour-long interview with him for my podcast. And I asked him about exactly that problem. And he said, look, we know that the way to reach the most Dutch citizens would be to use WhatsApp. But we think it's a very dangerous and surveillance tool. We ended up doing a big project using Telegram because we felt better about it. And Telegram, of course, isn't perfect, but it's maybe a step in the direction of transparency. And we were worried that we would lose people, but actually we have enough influence within the ecosystem that we were able to persuade a lot of people to try Telegram. And now, based on that experiment, we're thinking about, is there a moment where we move away from YouTube? So I don't expect to convince you here, but I want you to talk with him.
I will just finish and leave the floor to the questions, saying that I'm already convinced. I'm just waiting for the good tool.
Wonderful. I will open that conversation. But why don't you help us with? So let's see. Vanille has offered a question about some of the recent bold moves from social media platforms. Twitter shutting down Donald Trump's account, Facebook shutting down newspaper pages in Australia. So let me say, it's a very good question. Let me start by separating the two, because I think they're quite different. I think what's going on with shutting down the newspaper pages is a bit of bullying, right? I think it's basically Facebook saying, we're more important than the news, we're going to ignore this law. In Australia, it's really a negotiating tactic, and they didn't do it for very long. So, you know, honestly, I think the Australian law is a terrible law. But I think Facebook's unwillingness to come to the table was also pretty embarrassing. I don't think either side looks very good there. The shutting down of Donald Trump's account by Twitter and by Facebook, that I think is genuinely interesting, but I actually want to suggest that there's something much bigger going on. So over the summer in the United States, we saw an explosion of misinformation about coronavirus. You're probably aware that belief in coronavirus became very political in the United States. That Donald Trump sort of suggested that coronavirus wasn't real or that it wasn't serious, and that many, many people started spreading information suggesting that coronavirus was not a big deal. This reached a very scary moment when a video came up called Plandemic. And Plandemic made the case that coronavirus was developed in a lab. It was designed to benefit big companies. It was designed to benefit a government official in the US named Anthony Fauci. And that the worst thing you could do would be to wear a mask that would kill you. And this was clearly such dangerous disinformation that Facebook and YouTube and Google and everyone else took it down almost immediately. That's really unprecedented. We really had not seen a moment where companies had moved to take down content, really with the exception of terrorist content, right? Incitement to violence. This is the first time that we saw those companies act around misinformation rather than sort of supporting the right of anyone to say whatever they wanted. And that was a real shift, a really radical change in how media has been handled by these platforms. Since then, you've seen them be much more aggressive in taking down political disinformation, and going as far as to deplatform the sitting president, which is really quite a crazy thing to sort of think of. I think what the platforms are realizing is that people are now demanding that they don't just support an open environment for speech, but they also take some responsibility. And when things are irresponsible or societally dangerous, they're going in and taking that step. Now, let me say, I think in the short term, this is good. I think it's probably very good that that Plandemic video did not get widespread. I think in the long term, it's quite dangerous. I don't think having Facebook make a decision about speech is actually any better than having the government make a decision about speech. I think both of those are actually a very poor idea. You've seen my proposed solution, which is that I think communities have to make decisions about their own speech. But that works much better in a community of 200 or 2,000 than it does in a community of 2 billion. And one of the things that I fear is that we don't actually have a very good answer to the question of who should make the rules of what remains on Facebook. That's in part why I think we should actually rebuild social media in a way where those questions of moderation and governance are at the center rather than sort of coming in late in the debate. Bruno, do you want to read Maria's question, or do you want me just to answer it, or how do you want to handle that?
Please do that, because I do not see the questions for the moment.
It's
please,
just fine. I will moderate myself, my friend.
Okay.
You know that I am an immoderate individual, but I will
you'll be perfect. Please do so, Ethan.
I'll try to moderate. So Maria asked this question Is it more feasible to gear our efforts towards creating these new platforms instead of having governments regulate social media platforms? And what I would say in this is we obviously have to do both. We are hitting points of very dangerous sort of mis and disinformation. The platforms have to do more on their own. The governments have to provide them some guidance around what they can do safely. But we cannot get stuck in a world where all we are trying to do is fix the systems that we have. What we actually need to do is be sort of brave enough to imagine the systems that we want to have. For me, Facebook, the way it works right now, particularly this idea that Facebook, is following all of my words to figure out what to sell me, that Facebook is deciding which of my friends I should and shouldn't hear from, that Facebook has control over what is allowable as speech and what is not allowable as speech. That's not the optimum world that I want to live in. And so while it is useful to try to regulate that, to try to get the governments to regulate, to try to get those spaces to work better, I think it's important that we work towards our aspirations, that we work towards the worlds that we want and that we may be able to create at the same time. You must have more questions. I've said ludicrous things in this talk that may be completely untrue and that you should challenge me on. If you're more comfortable questioning in French, feel free, that's fine. Bruno can translate, I can read enough French to sort of get through. Please feel free to challenge. Otherwise, I'm going to put Natacha on the spot and ask if she has any questions sort of coming out of this.
On the chat, we have a question about French anti-COVID app. Can it be considered as a first step of government social media while keeping individuals' privacy?
Can you tell me what the app is? Do you know what it is, or should we invite the questioner to say a couple words?
Yes, we do, but the questioner can show you. I mean, let me show you the app.
It's a tracking app.
The tracking app about the COVID.
You have the app, Bruno.
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
I take it from that question, Natacha, that it's been controversial, yeah?
It's been highly controversial, and this app is the second version of the app, in fact. The first one was launched, was a disaster. Like the President Macron said, it's not a failure, it just didn't work. He said that on TV, and the second one, but it's a tracking app.
Yeah, so these are really interesting. I'm going to answer the question first as a technologist, and then I'll try to sort of get into the public policy pieces of it. I am skeptical of these apps as a technologist. And I'm skeptical for a couple of reasons. We know that global positioning is pretty inexact. We know that, for instance, in a city, the difference between standing next to someone on the sidewalk and standing on the other side of the street is probably a big difference as far as transmission goes. GPS often has a layer of error that is at least that big. We also know that physical co-presence, while dangerous, there's some co-presence that's more dangerous than others. Eating together is evidently about one of the most dangerous things that you can do. The app doesn't sort of tell these sorts of things. So my fear in some ways is that it's an attempt to solve a social problem with technologies that are not actually very well suited towards it. It's a hope that we have a sort of technological security blanket that solves our problems. As far as this question of what are the ethics of the government surveilling all of us for our benefit, it's very, very tricky, right? We know that this sort of data can be politically sensitive. We know that it can be sensitive in terms of markets. The flip side, of course, is that your mobile phone company already has all this data. They are already surveilling you in precisely this way. And there's a whole part of Orange or France Telecom or whoever else, trying to figure out how to market to you based on this. So, in some ways, if we're going to have a conversation about this, it's probably not coronavirus, which is the best place to have the conversation. Coronavirus, we can at least make the argument that maybe there are legitimate reasons to surveil you at all times. I would make the argument that, Orange or any other company simply should not be tracking that data on you. It's not data that you intend to give them. It's not data that actually benefits you. They should be required to throw it out as soon as they possibly can, which is pretty much the moment after you move away from that cell tower. I fear sometimes that apps like this, Bruno, are the back door for sort of ensuring geographic surveillance over long periods of time. So these apps happen in the US as well. I've opted out of them. But that's mostly because I stay in my home all the time. I no longer have a life. I no longer get out anywhere. But yes,
have a two-hander on this.
Yeah.
Based on an anecdote, last year I gave a course at NYU on financial crisis, so nothing to do with the topic we're discussing now. And one of the students had to give a talk on one technology, which is a big thing, which is payment systems with the phone and payment systems and the data implications of it. And the student who was giving the talk was a Chinese, and she was so much advanced in terms. I'm saying this, you can take it ironically or in some way, because her argument was to say, well, when I go to the supermarket, I don't even need my cell phone. I need my face, and then I have fed, and they have all the information. So a whole debate started, how can you agree that the government knows, and then on top of it, what they do with the data, they rate you as a citizen, and this information is then being used as potentially controlling you in a sort of political way. And she was saying, but who cares? And we know that the government has been, controlling us anyway through other means, so might be even better to be aware that we are being tracked. And so my question is, do you think there's a cultural diversity in the way we are tolerant to this approach, and whether other spheres of the world will evolve towards more acceptance of this implicit or even explicit control?
So remember that I started my talk talking about trust and trust in institutions. China is very, very interesting on the question of trust. There is incredibly low interpersonal trust in China. If you ask people in China, do you trust your neighbors? Do you trust the average citizen to do the right thing? The answer is just no. One of the experiments that gets done is called the wallet test. If you leave your wallet at the cafe, how likely are you to get it back? And that measure is sort of a measure of social confidence, right? So you might say, Parisians would say, maybe I have a 50% chance of getting it back. Chinese people would say that it's a 10% chance, right? So the trust, the interpersonal trust is much lower. By the way, when you read the book, Bruno, you'll find out that actually almost everybody underestimates that number. People are actually much more trustworthy than you think, which is fascinating. Most of us actually don't trust enough. But Chinese people, maybe because they mistrust their neighbors so much, tend to be highly trusting of institutions. They have one of the highest levels of government trust on record. Now, maybe this is because when researchers come by and say, do you trust the government? Everyone is afraid to say, of course, but it's actually very consistent with what we're seeing in Asia in particular. Rapidly developing economies often have very high institutional trust, very low interpersonal trust. And so this idea of, yeah, fine, the government can have my face, you know, I trust it, that's just fine. Maybe that's happening for many Chinese. It's certainly not how Uyghur Chinese feel, right? They've discovered that these systems are surveilling them and presenting them from public spaces. But that certainly does seem to be the dominant attitude of a majority of Han Chinese. And it's a very strange moment. It will be interesting to see if China keeps economically advancing at the pace it has been. Will they retain this trust? Will it be if the economy slows, or if the government, you know, really stumbles in a critical way, will that trust sort of go away? But you're right. For now, most of my Chinese students react to things like the social credit system by saying, you don't get it. Like, this is useful and we're not particularly worried about it. And your values around privacy may not be the same as our values. It's been really interesting to see. I answered 2 questions in just via text because they were fairly technical and I thought they might not be quite as interesting, but here are some broader ones. Kirilo asks, my question is that Google and Facebook can directly influence every part of our lives, starting from natality levels to a country to its election results. Their communities are bigger than the population of many countries. They can directly influence them, which is impossible for classical governments. Don't you think, taking into account their financial, marketing, technological powers, we've passed the point when we were able to stop them? So this is a great question. And I want to sort of focus in on this a little bit. There have been very good papers written demonstrating that something like Google can almost certainly affect election results. And honestly, we would have a very hard way of telling if they did. Facebook has published experiments where they've basically shown that they are able to increase voter turnout. Facebook has a pretty good way of guessing who you are likely to vote for. Is it possible that the reason so many people turned out to vote against Donald Trump was that Facebook turned out lots of voters for Joe Biden? We don't know. In fact, we can't know. We don't have the data. We don't have access to those systems. We would hope maybe that someone within the company would be a whistleblower and tell us. But honestly, we don't know. And it should make us very scared. This idea that I'm proposing of digital public infrastructures starts with social media, but gets more broad into things like search, into advertising systems, with the idea that these things should have some public funding, they should be transparent. But you raise a very, very good question about whether they will be enough. One of my answers to it is that when I've started creating tools, I created this tool called Gobo to let people have a bit more control over their social media feeds. And one of the most interesting features within it was you could see why a post had been put in your feed or why it had been excluded from your feed. And we released that, and 3 months later, Facebook introduced the exact same feature. And we certainly can't prove that Facebook took our feature. But it is a way of essentially trying to nudge these big companies. And right now, since we're barely regulating them, I think nudging them is not necessarily a bad idea. I think if you can show them alternate means of doing things and show popular support for it, they actually can be influenced. As for whether they can actually be sort of tackled and changed, you know, the pessimist, of course, says no. The optimist points out that these companies are only 15 or 20 years old. And I think this is one place where being present at the birth of these companies is actually sort of helpful. I often know personally the people who are running these companies. And I know that they're neither as smart or as sinister as we imagine. They are often, you know, well-meaning people sort of trying to figure out how to make these systems work. And I think these companies are maybe more vulnerable than we imagine. And I feel that way because I've seen other massive companies fall and sort of disappear before. So I'm not without hope about this. I think you're asking exactly the right questions, but I think the response is not to despair about it. I think the response is to actually sort of say, can you imagine and build an alternative? And then if you can do it, even as a proof of concept, can that shift the dialogue or sort of shift the landscape around these things? Vanille, and I apologize if I'm getting your name wrong, it cites a paper I wrote a very long time ago called the cute cat theory. Do you think people are still more interested in daily life content, or do you see a change in mentalities? Do you think that people are investing themselves more in contesting things than joining causes? Vanille, in the book that I just finished writing, it's a very optimistic book in the sense that I've been amazed at young people's willingness to not necessarily get involved with political parties or get involved with formal politics, but to get involved with causes that they think are critically important. We've seen in the US a wave of movements that are deeply personal. The movement for Black Lives or Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, the anti-gun movement that came out of the shooting at the Marjory Stoneman Douglas School. These all have political implications, but at the end of the day, these are movements that are coming out of people's personal experiences. People get involved with Me Too because they have been sexually harassed or assaulted, or they know someone who has been sexually harassed or assaulted. And by speaking about it and demanding accountability for it, they are seeking social change. And so I think what I would say is I see politics and civics in the US, at least, becoming much less abstract and becoming less about ideologies, less about even sometimes formal policies, and more about uncovering these sort of very deep truths that we've somehow learned to live with. You know, my country right now is very, very troubled. It's very troubled racially. It's very troubled politically. It's very troubled with a health system that is failing us at a critical moment. And it almost feels like we need people, and particularly young people, just to sort of stand up and show us the truth. And we're now seeing kids close to my son's age, my son is 11, you know, sort of reminding us that several times a year, they have to have drills to protect themselves from a gunman coming into their schools. You know, my son commented that it's been really nice to have a year without an active shooter drill because he's been safe at home, and sort of think out loud, maybe I should just stay at home and be educated at home because then I can't be gunned down. That sort of craziness and that sort of personal impact of it, I see that as sort of leading contestation and sort of leading movements in the US right now. And I'm actually very optimistic about where some of those movements might end up leading. Anybody else? Anyone else want to ask something? Whether it's technical or whether it's social. Anyone sort of wonder, you know, whether these models play out very differently in France than they might play out in the US or elsewhere?
Le nocturne est trop nocturne, Natacha, tu crois?
Pourtant, we still have many people listening. I have a few questions myself, but
yeah,
I don't
please,
want to
Natasha.
go ahead, Natacha, please.
One is on the regulatory developments, and I was wondering, where do you see them going in the US, and what do you think about it? Because there are lots of thoughts and lots of thinking and legislative thinking at the European level, but the compass is not clear. So it would be interesting to hear how it is in the US.
So we're having at least two conversations in the US. One is really stupid and one is less stupid. So let's talk about the stupid one first. The stupid one is about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. So this is a section of US law that essentially says if you are running an online service like Facebook or YouTube, we do not consider you to be the publisher of content. We consider you to be a channel through which individuals can publish. So if I make a video that says Bruno Patino is corrupt and dangerous and undermining French society and evil in all sorts of ways, and I post it on YouTube, I may be libeling my friend, but YouTube is not libeling my friend. And this section of law functionally makes the modern internet possible. It is overbroad. It is sometimes used in an excuse in ways that is not very helpful. But the threats, particularly from President Trump to get rid of it, are unhelpful and largely not meaningful. He's threatening this because he dislikes the fact that these companies, which are private actors, have ended up expressing opinions about his speech. And this is a way to sort of strike back at them. The truth is, getting rid of 230 would be a disaster. What you might need is conversation about ways in which harassment is now sort of occurring online and how platforms should be more involved with releasing information to law enforcement to allow that harassment to be combated. But that's not where that debate is going. A more interesting debate has to do with transparency, particularly around algorithms. So there's been a lot of investigation that suggests that Facebook in particular has been trying to keep both liberals and conservatives happy and has been sort of adjusting its algorithms in a way that they try very hard not to hurt either side politically. And that sounds wise until you figure out that the conservatives in the US are basically pursuing a strategy that focuses on mis and disinformation. And so what this has meant is that a lot of mis and disinformation is remaining on the platforms because of fear of being biased against conservatives. And what you might actually need is a government regulator who's capable of looking at these algorithms and making some judgment about whether they are fair or unfair. And there are some early legislative paths that might sort of get us there. There's some early legislative paths that are trying to do some smart things around competition in social networks. But mostly we were focused on the stupid discussion rather than the interesting discussion. Let me say one thing about European policymaking, which is far from my field of expertise, but it is something that came up in this most recent report we did. We did this 70-page report on how do scholars study the internet? How do you do research like the research that Bruno and I and Dominique Cardon did about extremism in French media and polarization and the spread of ideas? And we ended up using some data from Twitter and some data from my tool, Media Cloud, but there were huge amounts of data that we wanted that we couldn't get. We ended up having to say, we know Facebook's incredibly important, and we just couldn't study it. There was just no way to get the data. And we are finding that one of the unfortunate consequences of GDPR is that it is the perfect excuse of Facebook and other platforms not to give out any data. And that what happened when privacy advocates correctly fought for rights under GDPR, they really didn't consider our ability to study and audit these platforms. And that the next round, before we do another regulatory round on these platforms, we actually have to think very seriously about our ability to study them and our ability to have sort of a transparent understanding of them. And let me just say, we were hugely surprised by it. It was one of those things where it was sort of like, oh, yes, I'm sure we didn't mean to do that. But it's a very unfortunate problem of the work that we've ended up doing together. Should we take, we have no, we have one more here. Let's see. Maria, again, I am wondering how different definitions of freedom of speech will affect international governance on this issue. For example, in the US, hate speech is kind of protected, whereas in France it is not. How could we bridge these diverse principles? Yeah, it's interesting. Hate speech is, as far as I understand, treated differently under US and French law. It's not strictly legal in the US. It is in a different regulatory space. The danger in the US is incitement to violence. You can say, I hate Black people, but as soon as you say, I hate Black people and people should kill them, then you start finding yourself in dangerous grounds in the US. I think it's very unlikely that we're going to get global consensus on what constitutes dangerous or hate speech. And I would argue that context is incredibly important for sort of understanding these things. In many ways, what I would say is I think this is another place where we have to get small rather than get big. Here's an example that I often teach in my classes. I have a lot of friends in Sri Lanka, and I study how social media has been used for extremism in Sri Lanka. So there's a video that ended up being characterized as hate speech in Sri Lanka. So let me describe this video to you. A young woman walks into a department store. We see her go select a brassiere. She takes the brassiere, she takes a knife and cuts one of the bra cups and she squeezes it, and we see that there's a gel inside the brassiere. That video is hate speech. Why is that video hate speech? It's hate speech because in Sri Lanka, there is a rumor that Muslims who tend to be the merchants, who tend to be the people selling things, are using a campaign of biological warfare against Buddhists to prevent Buddhists from having children. And so the gel in the bra is meant to tell you that this is how the Muslims are poisoning the Buddhists. And if you wear this bra, you will become sterile and it will shrink the Buddhist population of Sri Lanka. It's very hard to imagine a global standard for hate speech that is going to figure out how to deal with a case like that. You really need to know that context to have any ability to sort of deal with it. And so what I would argue is that hate is contextual. It's deeply contextual. It can be down to the stories and the norms and the ideas in a very specific community. And for me, you would have to find a way to govern these things locally rather than governing these things globally. Gianna Mina has a question about what will somehow replace the third-party cookie in terms of efficiency. So let's talk about cookies, right? Cookies were something that was created very, very early in the days of the web. And it was created for a very specific purpose. Web servers, by default, just hand you pages. They don't know where you are between you requesting pages. So you request the first page of the web server, and then you request a piece on a product, and then you request a payment page. The web server by default doesn't know that you are the same person. It just knows that someone is requesting that page. A cookie lets you maintain continuity. It says, oh, you are the person who just wanted to buy Ethan's new book. I put it in a shopping cart for you. Now I'm going to take you to checkout so you can enter your credit card and we'll go ahead and buy the book. So cookies by themselves are not inherently evil. They're actually very useful. what started happening is what's called third-party cookies. So this was when I go and visit Arte's website, and it's fine for Arte to be tracking me, but it's probably not great that Facebook is tracking me, or that Le Monde is tracking me, or that Google's tracking me, because Arte has allowed them to set what's called a third-party cookie. What third-party cookies are designed to do is to build a psychographic profile of me. Where is it that this guy, Ethan Zuckerman, goes on the web? Oh, he goes to Arte, and he goes to Facebook, and he goes to this site about football. Now I know something about this, I can better target an ad. The first thing I would say is get rid of them. There's very few legitimate uses for them. They're generally being used for surveillance capitalism. One object would just be to say, we just shouldn't have them. The second is that Google is trying to get rid of them, but not necessarily for good reasons. Google can track you through your own browser, and they have enough confidence that they can track you either through the Chrome browser or through fingerprinting other browsers, that what they basically said is, we just don't need third-party cookies anymore, so we're not going to support them. But it's not that Google is sort of saying we are great champions of privacy and we just don't think they should be out there. Google just feels like they can do a better job than third-party cookies can. Third-party cookies are a fine place to go after something legislatively. I think what I'd love to hear, potentially from someone who's much smarter than I am about these things, is whether there are legitimate uses that we would want to find replacement for if we weren't able to use them that way. Shenning Chan has asked, Facebook has established an oversight board composed of experts from different fields to help them make decisions on content moderation. Twitter and TikTok are following this trend. Twitter's Birdwatch, TikTok's EU Consulting Committee. Can I comment on these new initiatives to regulate the content? So yeah, I actually am pretty supportive of the oversight board. It's very fashionable right now to beat up on everything that Facebook is doing. And I certainly think Facebook has a lot of things to answer for. But I think the attempt at an oversight board is not a bad thing at all. It's worth noting that the oversight board has fairly limited authority over what it can weigh in on. It doesn't weigh in on prioritization on the news feed. It really just weighs in on whether content can remain up or go down. But I actually think many things they did were pretty smart. I think it was pretty smart to look at very high quality international experts. I think it was pretty smart to try to do it where cases will serve as precedent for subsequent cases. The thing that I think was smartest was that right now we have a system that really has no process to it. There's no appeals process, there's no transparency. This is at least a step at creating a process. And whether it is the perfect process or the right process, the jury is out. But moving towards process is a step in the right direction. I think we should always ask the question, are these processes real? Do they have teeth? Can they actually force companies to do things that they don't want to do? So far, the oversight board has largely made things easier for Facebook. I think people are going to watch that very closely. The question may be if the oversight board starts making decisions that make business more difficult for Facebook. But I'm actually generally supportive of this. So let's see. The Cloud Act in the US, the fact that it can be in conflict with GDPR, I don't know the Cloud Act well enough to sort of know the places where it's going to cross over. My understanding of it, in a very cursory sense, is that it's an attempt to sort of share information when there's legitimate warrants and sort of be able to search for information about US citizens in cases that might be on European servers. you know, these are incredibly challenging questions. And, you know, it's not just the US that's sort of running into these problems of essentially saying, we want to get data and we don't like the rules that it's being held under. We've had this happen with all sorts of other countries, and you know, the resolution tends to be to try to force people to put infrastructure in a country that you feel like you have control over. You know, this is how China's dealt with this. They basically said, if you want to operate in China, you're going to move the servers into China. My guess is that the US, at least under Biden, is not so isolationist that they're willing to give up a global footprint in exchange for, you know, having full reach of law, extraterritorial in terms of extraterritory. I do think this is one of those places where many civil rights advocates are hoping that European law will be much stronger on issues of privacy than US law ends up being. But I'm not a lawyer, and I just don't know enough about it to be able to say anything rational about it.
Okay. If there, I think it's 9:05. If there is no other questions, well, Ethan, please, if there is no other questions, I really want to thank you in the name of Sciences Po, of EMI, of Natacha, and of myself. Ethan, it's been, as always, both brilliant, convincing, friendly also, and you challenged me on a personal level, so I will try to meet your challenge. And I look forward to talking to you about it. And I'm absolutely sure the students were both impressed and happy to have been able to share your thoughts and your work. So merci,
Well,
merci mille fois, my friend.
The questions were really, really excellent. I always so much enjoy talking with you. I hope for all of my friends at Sciences Po we'll be doing this in person and then going out for a nice coffee afterwards next time. Hoping for a better world in the near future. But thank you for the invitation, for being such a wonderful audience. It's just wonderful to spend the time with you. So cheers.
You're most welcome to the school whenever you can cross the Atlantic. So you'll be our guest.
I will be back soon. Take care, everyone. Ciao. Good night.
Good night. Thank you, Ethan.
Sure. Bye-bye.
Bonne nuit à tout le monde. Merci.
Bonne nuit.
Bonne nuit.